So my name's Stuart, and I'm, of course, one of the Trust's young leaders, but I'm also a ranger at the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland's Highland Wildlife Park, and my office is about 100 metres from Helen's tonight, so I'm quite privileged to be working side by side with the Saving Wildcats project. And so tonight's webinar is hosted by the Scottish Wildlife Trust Young Leaders, and just to give you an idea of who we are, we're a volunteer group of young people aged 20 to 30 who, of course, are very passionate about the natural world and the conservation of Scotland's wildlife. We meet once a week to discuss and plan projects that we're directly involved in, and also to share opportunities and ideas for the group to expand on. And I think the work that we do is best summed up by the 5 goals that we laid out for ourselves in 2023, which is to communicate about the climate and biodiversity crises, to involve young people in decision-making and amplify their voices, to engage young people with nature and wildlife in Scotland and empower them with the tools and skills they need to take action, to create networks and communities through social media and events, and of course contribute to and amplify the work of the Scottish Wildlife Trust. So the funds being raised for tonight are actually going towards an event that the young leaders will be organising in spring of next year at the Falls of Clyde. Should be exciting. And so I'll hand on now to my fellow young leaders to introduce themselves, but just wanted to quickly say on behalf of the young leaders, thank you everyone for coming tonight, and for those watching this back later, because I think I'm not alone in saying that the Saving Wildcats project is exemplary in its ambition, and it's an incredibly bold leap in the right direction to restore Scotland's ecosystems, protect its native species, and paint generally a brighter future for young people living today and the many generations to come. So I'll hand on now to my fellow young leaders to introduce themselves as well.
Hi there, I'm happy to go next. So my name's Jessie, and like Stuart, I am a Scottish Wildlife Trust young leader. And also like Stuart and Helen, I also work for the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland as a fundraiser. So I fundraise for Saving Wildcats, which is a great privilege. And it's lovely to be here with you all this evening. Colette, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yes, so I'm also one of the young leaders, and I work as a data technician, an environmental data technician with Natural Power. And again, I hope you enjoy this evening's talk.
Hi there, I'm Johnny. I'm also one of the young leaders. I'm a bit fresher out of uni. I'm currently working at Tyzo in Edinburgh at the minute, so you can come say hi to me there. I hope you enjoy the talk.
So Helen, I think we're ready for you to start your presentation. So let's get stuck into this really exciting project.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you so much, Stuart, Jessie, Jonathan and Colette. And it's a real privilege to be invited here to speak with you. And also we've got a long history of working together with the Trust previously on the Scottish Beavers project. So it's really great to be able to come and talk to you this evening about the Saving Wildcats project. So I'll just share my presentation. Hopefully that is up on screen. Yeah, so my name's Helen Senn. I'm Head of Conservation and Science at the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, which is the conservation charity that owns Edinburgh Zoo and Highland Wildlife Park. And we also conduct conservation projects in Scotland and all around the world. And one of our big conservation projects at the moment is the Saving Wildcats project. I'm the project lead. And really what I want to talk to you about today is, I guess, the kind of mammoth and collaborative effort that it takes to start down the path of really trying to recover a species that's on the brink of extinction. So I think one of the key messages I want to get across is that a project like this and recovering an important species like this, an iconic species like this, isn't something that one person can do or even one organisation can do, or that can be done quickly. It requires a lot of planning and collaboration and people working together and kind of long-term thinking as well. And so that's probably one of my key messages from the talk today. But I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about this project. So Saving Wildcats is a partnership project. It's funded primarily by the European Union by a big life grant. And it's a partnership between the Scottish organisations, so the Royal Zoological Society, the Cairngorms National Park Authority, Nature Scot, Forestry and Land Scotland in Scotland, and then Nordens Ark, which is a conservation-focused zoo in Sweden, and Junta de Andalucía, which is the government of Andalusia in Spain, which are the leaders of the Iberian Lynx Recovery Project, which is one of the most successful carnivore recovery projects that's happened to date. And so we're really grateful to be able to partner with them to learn a huge amount, and it's really informed our approach. So this is one of the first wildcats to be released back into the wild in Scotland in the Cairngorms National Park on the 12th of June this year. And this was a really exciting moment, and here it is taking some of the first steps back into the wild. And so it was a big moment for everybody, and great to be able to see the pictures of this cat, which is wearing a GPS collar, taking its first steps out into the wild. But I really want to talk to you about how we got to this point, and some of the history, and hopefully where we're going next. So the wildcat status today is that wildcats are mainland Britain's last wild living felid, and they are critically endangered. So that it's very complicated to estimate, gain estimates of an elusive animal, but the official estimates are that there's probably around between 100 and 300 animals. But actually, we know from genetic analysis that most of the animals that we find in the wild are hybrids. Hybridization is a big threat. And so really, experts believe there's far fewer than that left in the wild. And persecution remains a really high threat for this species. And across the UK, at any one point in time, there's around 150 wildcats in captivity, spread across a range of different zoos that are all collaborating together on conservation breeding for this species. And so captive management has formed an important part of what we call the insurance policy for this species, and it effectively is a part of the conservation strategy going forwards. In my talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got from wildcats arriving in Britain 9,000 years ago to where we are today, which is really effectively a story of the population decline, and then a number of different conservation activities that have tried to recover that population. So this is the European wildcat. It's a feisty small carnivore, the thing I wanted to say here is that we call it the European wildcat. It's the same species found in Britain as on mainland Europe. And wildcats like to live in a mixed habitat of forest and rough grassland, and that's really important for their prey species, which are rabbits and voles and mice, and also small birds. And in terms of the history of the wildcat on mainland Britain, really the first elements of decline, or the first threats for the species decline, was hunting and habitat loss. Really dramatic habitat loss and high levels of persecution. And by the 1800s, wildcats were extinct from England and Wales. And then the rise of shooting estates from about 1800 onwards really led to an escalation of predator control. And by the 1950s, wildcats became extinct across much of northern Scotland. And by the end of the 19th century, wildcats were really nearly extinct. And we think that 1915 is about the population low. And after World War I, there was some expansion of the population back out into different reforested areas. And probably the mid-20th century was the recent population peak. But by the 1960s and 70s, there began to be a decline again, particularly as threats were re-established, and probably actually as technology around persecution became more efficient. And they weren't legally protected in the UK until 1988. And there isn't protection for wildcat hybrids. Wildcats interbreed with domestic cats. So wildcats and domestic cats are closely related species, and they're separated by probably about 1 million years of evolutionary history. The estimates vary a little bit. And they crossbreed or hybridize, and the offspring are viable and fertile, so they can then breed with other wildcats or other domestic cats. And so hybridization is probably a symptom, not a cause of population decline, because there hasn't really been a lot of evidence of wildcat hybridization in the past. It's a much more recent phenomenon. And we know that from the genetic analysis that's been conducted on wildcat populations. There's two ways of distinguishing them. One is using pelage characteristics, which is really looking at the markings on the coat. And this is on the left-hand side here. You've got classic pelage markings from a wildcat, things like having stripes on the tail, a big bushy tail. And on the left-hand side, this is what we call a tabby domestic cat. And that's used heavily as a tool for identifying and differentiating between wildcats and their hybrids and tabby domestic cats in the field. Genetic research, as I mentioned, has shown that hybridization escalated from the 1960s onwards. We can use genetic testing to distinguish wildcats and domestic cats, although that can only be applied in certain contexts, so not easy to apply a genetic test in the field, but it's been very helpful in terms of us understanding the background situation with wildcats and wildcat hybridization, and also particularly for managing the captive breeding population. And genetic testing has shown that Scotland has the most hybridized population of wildcats in Europe. Most of the wild living cats that you find in Scotland that look like they could be a wildcat are actually hybrids. And there's been quite a bit of research published on that. During the 1990s, people started to become quite concerned, or the 1980s and 1990s, people started to become quite concerned about the status of wildcats, really probably for the first time. And this started a kind of, a lot of research on behavior and habitat use and diet and genetics and the pelage and the phenotype of the wildcat. And we generated a lot of understanding of what was going on. But during that time, wildcat populations, unfortunately, were probably continuing to decline. And it wasn't until 2010 that the first targeted conservation action happened to really try and start to reverse the decline of wildcats. So the first project was the Cairngorms Wildcat Project, sometimes called the Thailand Tiger Project. And it was really focused in trying to minimize some of the threats in what was thought to be the wildcat's last population stronghold at that point, or one of the main population strongholds within the Cairngorms National Park. And that project focused on trying to engage with land managers and gamekeepers on reducing the threats around wildcat management, and also focusing on responsible domestic pet ownership. And then in 2015, that led to the first national Scottish Wildcat Conservation Project. Partners, Scottish Wildlife Trust are also partners in that project, along with RZFS as well. And that was really focusing on trying to recover the wildcat populations in identified priority areas in Scotland. So these were areas that were thought to be wildcat strongholds, and similar actions were run in these strongholds. So doing surveys to look for cats, doing trap, neuter, vaccinate, release to control the threat from domestic feral cats, and doing responsible pet ownership campaigns and trying to minimise the threats from persecution. But alongside that, there was also a task to try and understand a little bit captive population. Wasn't so much known about the captive population at that point. There were only about 60 animals in captivity, and RZFS was tasked with trying to understand more about the captive population and grow and expand it, and so that happened in parallel to the population actions that were happening in situ, and in situ is what we call field-based conservation, in situ is what we call captive conservation. So these two actions ran alongside each other. And unfortunately, though partway through the project in 2019, there was a sense from a lot of the people that were working on the project that the situation on the ground was a lot worse than had really been anticipated previously. So there had been this assumption that there was still some quite good wildcat populations out there, but actually as the field team went out onto the ground, it was really apparent that there weren't that many wildcats left, and the wildcats that were there were very hybridized individuals, and there were very few of them, and that probably the populations were animals were too few and too widely dispersed and too hybridized to form a kind of viable population that could be recovered just through kind of field-based actions alone. And the project partners were really obviously concerned about this, and we invited the International Union for Conservation of Nature cat specialist group. That's a very long word, long phrase, but basically they're effectively the kind of global authority on cat feeded conservation, to do an independent review. And that those people concluded that the wildcat population in Scotland was no longer viable without outside help, and that urgent action was needed to help recover wildcats, unless they were, and if not, they would be lost forever from Britain. And that's really how the Saving Wildcats project then started. And one of the recommendations was that reintroductions or releases of wildcats back to the wild would be required in order to do that, along with controlling the threats that were causing the decline of wildcats in the first place. So that was really how the Saving Wildcats project was born. And I guess it's really important for all projects to have a vision, to understand where they're trying to head to, even if that's in a very idealised scenario. And our vision is to restore wildcats to landscapes across Scotland, and that they're really valued by people, because it's extremely important that people especially people who live cheek by jowl with wildcats, feel that they are part of their landscape and feel that they're the guardians of them. And it's a European partnership project dedicated to Scottish wildcat conservation and recovery. And what we're going to be doing is the plan for the project really is to recover them using conservation, breeding and release. So that's the tool. And the European partnership aspect of it is really important because, as I mentioned right at the start of my talk, it's really technical and it's a long-term, it's kind of an uphill struggle trying to recover a species from the brink of extinction, from, I suppose we could say, 5 minutes to midnight. And it's really important, if you're at that point, that you try and learn as much as possible from everybody else or other projects that have gone before you. And so we're really grateful to be able to learn from a whole range of other projects internationally, and not least the Iberian Lynx project, to kind of inform how to conduct a technical project. So in terms of the kind of plan for the project, effectively is a sort of project of two halves. Everything to do in the first half of the project, for the first 3 years of the project, was about preparing for the releases, and then the second half of the project was about doing the releases. And so really in the first half of the project, we were kind of working on two things in parallel. One was making sure that everything to do with the release site was suitable, And then the other was making sure that we had the conservation breeding situation up to speed, so that we had enough cats to release at the point where we were happy that we could release them into the release site. So the first 3 years involved. And I guess for those of you that are maybe thinking of studying conservation or working in conservation later, it's a really I guess there's lots of information out there on how to run conservation projects or how to plan conservation projects, and these are some of the kind of guidelines or documents that we've tried to kind of follow in order to inform how we plan a conservation project, because it's quite involves a lot of people and a lot of different, I guess, disciplines. It's quite interdisciplinary and a lot of different considerations, and so there's some really great guidance and advice out there for anyone who's interested in working in conservation project management or participating in recovery projects like this. And in Scotland, we're really lucky. We've got the Scottish Code for Translocations, which also helps to guide how conservation translocation or reintroduction projects should be kind of planned and run. And as I mentioned, it's not possible to do a project like this as a single person. I'm really lucky to have a great team of people here working at the Highland Wildlife Park. We've got our ex situ team, our keepers and ex situ manager who look after the wildcats in captivity, and our field team who are out and about all the time, monitoring the release site and looking after the cats in the wild. And we work in partnership with a whole range of different people. So the project aims for conservation breeding, first of all, was really to make sure that we had enough wildcats to release. That was kind of number one. And that's kind of easy to say that, but actually it's really important that our captive breeding population of 150 animals is there and can potentially help with recovering other populations or help support other releases in future. So it's really important in terms of how you plan a release that you don't deplete the insurance population. And so part of that strategy was to breed wildcats in a dedicated facility, and that's built away from the public. It's at the Highland Wildlife Park. For anyone who's familiar with the Highland Wildlife Park, it's kind of at the back, the drive-through section, but it's away from any general public. And we took 8 pairs from the conservation breeding program from a variety of institutions, and these were bred in these breeding enclosures. And the kittens are then moved to larger pre-release enclosures at aged 5 to 6 months, where they spend another few months before they're released at about a year old. And this is just an aerial shot of the conservation breeding for release centre at the Highland Wildlife Park, and here and down on the towards the bottom left. Those are the breeding enclosures, and then and sort of top and to the right, there's a large naturalistic pre-release enclosures with lots of natural habitat in them, and they're open topped, and the whole facility is overlooked by a large number of almost more than 70 CCTV cameras, which help us with the management. And the management approach is very hands-off. It's a little bit more hands-on in the breeding enclosures, and then much more hands-off when the cats are moved to the pre-release enclosures. And the centre that we have at the Highland Wildlife Park is modelled on the Iberian lynx centre that's found in Spain and Portugal in terms of its design. And really the purpose of the breeding enclosures is to make baby kittens, and here are some of the kittens in the breeding enclosures. And these kittens then, once they're born, they're then moved to the pre-release enclosures for preparation going back to the wild. And then once those kittens are moved, the cycle of breeding starts again ready to prepare the next cohort of cats to go out the following year. Everything to do with the pre-release management of the wildcats is carefully monitored. We do that using CCTV cameras, and so this is just a kind of setup of our CCTV HQ, which is quite a long way away from the actual breeding centre. So it allows us to really look at the wildcats without having to go and disturb them, and also to do things like, for example, monitor their reaction to keepers approaching the enclosures in order to feed them. So somebody's able to sit down here and look at their CCTV while the keeping team are out travelling up to the centre and then delivering food and watching individual cat behaviour to see whether or not the cats are reacting to the keepers arriving, and ideally we want low levels of positive response to that. And this is just a picture of the kind of inside of some of the enclosures. We use kind of various different we do various different kind of data recording activities on the cats as they're being prepared for release, to understand more about their behaviour. And we don't really know at the moment what sort of behaviours translate into being a successful wildcat in the wild, and we might not know that for some time to come, but it's really important that we lay the foundations to sort of gather that data earlier on. And just a little bit of a kind of idea of how we use the CCTV facility to monitor different wildcats. This is a cat that's being kind of watched for a specific period of time, and all of its behaviours being recorded. And we use these different climbing structures and what we call hobbit boxes for the cats to have shelter and have a variety of environments to operate in. So that's a bit about the preparation of the captive population for release. And in parallel, it was really important that we understood as much as possible about what was happening in the wild. And so the field team have a number of different tasks: assessing the release site, preparing it, and monitoring it. And so just a little bit more about what they do. The release site itself is the Cairngorms Connect landscape. Really grateful to have partnership with this fantastic ecological restoration project, which is committed to a bold and ambitious 200-year vision to enhance habitat, species and ecological processes within the Cairngorms National Park. And it's really important when you're investing so much in kind of effort in trying to recover a species, it's really important that species is then released into an area where there's a really kind of solid plan in terms of how that landscape and that environment is being managed and being restored. And so we're really grateful to be able to partner with Cairngorms Connect on that. And it was assessed because there's sufficient suitable habitat in the release site as well to support a viable population of wildcats, or at least that's the theory that the modelling that we had to use in order to kind of design the project told us. In practice, we won't really know that until we actually see what happens with the release. So just a little bit more about what the field team have been up to. Big task has been conducting ecological surveys and monitoring. There's a huge camera trap grid all across the release site, over 100 different cameras, keeping an eye out for wild living cats, so potentially feral or domestic cats, prey species and other mesocarnivores and other protected species. And the field team have also been conducting dedicated prey surveys across the release site. And these surveys were conducted in 2020, and then they've been followed up annually since. And in terms of the camera trapping, we've got over 100 camera traps deployed over 200 square kilometres, and they're really out there to detect the abundance and distribution of a whole range of species. And this is just a few kind of examples of the sorts of things that have been found out there by the team. And there's an enormous job of sifting through all the camera trap images and then trying to and then producing distribution maps to look at where different species are. And all of this informed our kind of spatial planning for the eventual releases. The surveys for different prey species carried out in collaboration with the long-term monitoring project that's been conducted in Cairngorms Connect by the Cairngorms Connect Predator Project. And that's really great because it's fantastic to be able to release animals into an area where quite a lot is already understood about the prey cycle or the prey dynamics. And one of the really important tasks of what we call the baseline survey or the pre-release surveys was to understand how many feral or hybrid domestic cats there are in the release site. And the release site was also chosen because it's actually really low in feral hybrid domestic cats, and they're mostly the cats that we have found are mostly found around farms or the edge of human settlements. And quite a lot of the cats that have been were seen during the pre-release surveys were actually, although they maybe appeared to be feral cats, quite a lot of them were actually tracked down by going door to door and speaking to people as owned pet cats. All of the cats in the release site are recorded in what we call a catalogue, and that allows the field team to make sure they know who's who, they've got an eye on everybody. And obviously one of the really important tasks is to follow up to check whether cats are owned or feral cats, and if they're feral and neutered, then it would be we send the field team out to trap them and conduct what we call TNVR, which is trap, neuter, vaccinate, return. It's the national strategy for feral cat control for wildcat conservation, and it's a really important tool to reduce the risk of hybridization and disease transfer from wildcats. Feral cats are trapped. They are health checked and then neutered and vaccinated by a vet. This can either be by one of the vets we have at the Highland Wildlife Park or in partnership. We work really closely in partnership with Cats Protection and local veterinary surgeries who have done a huge amount on this over many years in the local area, and we're extremely grateful for their support. And the cats are then returned to the site where they're trapped. And this is just Lara and Kerry from our field team, releasing one of the cats that had undergone TNVR. And samples are taken for disease and genetic testing, so it allows us to keep an eye on what's going on in the local cat populations. It's really important as well that that our presence in the area is accompanied by responsible cat ownership messaging, and we work closely with people in the local areas to encourage neutering, vaccinating and microchipping of pet cats. And actually there's a really high awareness within the local area that this is an important thing to do, because there's been wildcat conservation action happening for such a long time in the Cairngorms area, and most people really understand the importance of this and have super cats which are neutered, vaccinated and microchipped. In preparation for the releases, we conducted a lot of surveys and conversations with the local community. This was really quite challenging because back in 2020 there were real restrictions because of COVID on any kind of face-to-face interaction, and that certainly isn't ideal when you're starting a conservation project like this. So we ran webinars like this, and we did a postcard drop across all of the houses in the wider project area, about 7,000 households, and people received a link to a questionnaire about their attitudes towards responsible cat ownership, and also to wildcat restoration in the local area. And the responses in general were really positive about wildcats, but also allowed us to identify a number of different concerns. We've run lots of outreach and engagement activities with the local community, making sure everybody's, as many people as possible, that are up to speed with what's going on with the project and understand the importance of wildcat conservation. So I was talking to local school children and attending game fairs and speaking to local rangers, a whole range of different people. We're really keen as a project to link with local businesses. We're in an area where the wildcat is a symbol for lots of different things. There's a strong association with different clans, including Clan Macpherson, and in Newtonmore, which is actually where I live, the wildcat is actually an emblem on the village sign, and there's lots of places where it appears in the crest of the high school, and there's a variety of different brands as well that use wildcat on their branding, and so we've been really keen to try and work together with local businesses, including the Newtonmore Wildcat Trail, which is a community enterprise where you can follow and walk around the community woodlands in Newtonmore and around the village, and follow and collect various different painted wildcats that are hiding throughout the forest. So it's really great to have that sense where we are, that wildcats are an important part of the local community, and keen to link with that. We've run a whole variety of different drop-in sessions and informal interviews with almost 60 different local landowners across the release site and in the wider project area. And that's really important because we know that wildcats come into conflict with game management activities. It's one of the reasons, as I mentioned, persecution and accidental persecution because of ongoing predator control activities is one of the real risk factors for wildcats, and one of the things that has led to their extinction. And so it's really important to have an open dialogue and discuss concerns. Yeah, that's something that we've done quite a lot, and we continue to do a lot during the course of the releases. So all of those two things have came together in June for the first trial releases. And so a little bit about the release strategy. So we adopted what's called a soft or delayed release strategy. So this is a strategy where the wildcats were moved from the breeding centre at the Highland Wildlife Park, from the pre-release enclosures, into smaller enclosures located in secret locations at the release site. And they spent a few days in those pens before being released. The releases happened between June and September, which is the peak prey availability and the lowest chance of road mortality. And all of the cats are collared with GPS collars. And at this point, they're between a year and 18 months old. And at this point, they're big enough to take a GPS collar. And we release the cats in several different cohorts. And it's really important, obviously, once you conduct a release, to do post-release monitoring. And that's been done with the aid of the GPS collars, continuing monitoring with our camera trap array, but also we're using other information like collecting scats from the cats, and we'll be doing some dietary analysis in due course on them, and collecting local sightings information. We use the collars that have been used really widely across Europe to monitor wildcats. It's great because it's a technique that's been tried before, and they've also previously been used to track hybrid wildcats in Scotland, and we collaborate closely with Kerry Kilshaw at Wild Crew in order to make use of some of the research that she did a few years ago on that. And the data is stored on the collars and then manually downloaded in the field. And we estimate that we're going to be able to track the cats for up to 9 months using these collars. So 19 in total. So far, 19 wildcats have been released. And the release locations have obviously been kept secret, and the pens are monitored continuously throughout the release period using a variety of surveillance methods. And really now the job of the field team is to go and track those cats with both the collars and the camera traps. Throughout the process, we've kept in regular communication with landowners in around the release site, and particularly gamekeepers. And our field team currently run a huge number of WhatsApp groups where different landowners are able to opt in to be part of receiving specific updates about animals that are on their land. There's one, so far we've recorded one mortality of the released cats, and the rest of the cats are out and about, and most of them are within close proximity to the release site. And obviously, as we now go into winter, we'll be continuing to observe their behaviour really closely. And this is just a picture of another picture of one of the first cats to be released. And I think that's probably me coming up for the end of the presentation, but I'm just going to show you a few of the videos from some of the first releases of Wildcats to Scotland this summer. So this is one of the cats that's coming out of the pre-release, the soft release, enclosures. And the enclosures, the cats are left in the enclosures for a few days prior to release, and then the doors are opened very quietly during the night time, and the cats are allowed to left to come out kind of under their own steam. This is one of the cats leaving during the day. This is another cat leaving at night time, and heading off into the wild for its first taste of freedom. Yeah, so really exciting moment to see that. And this is just a picture of the field team who are now out and about on a daily basis, tracking the wildcats. Huge job to keep track of them and download that data so we can look and see how they're all doing. And in the meantime, back home at the breeding centre, our keeping team are working hard on preparing the next cohort of wildcats for release next summer. So we're already gearing up for that. So it's been a busy time, but it's been extremely exciting. So we're going to be following up the releases of 19 wildcats this year with further wildcats releases in 2024 and 2025. And of course, the $1 million question is all this effort and hard work going to pay off, and will the wildcats establish back at the release site? There's lots that could go into that, and we won't really know until quite a bit more time has passed whether we're on the right track. But I'm sure it's going to take a few years for us to get there. So I just want to end by thanking all of our supporters. As I mentioned, this is a big project, and there's a huge number of people and organisations that have really helped to make this happen. We've got some really great supporters. As I said, there's a lot of different zoos and wildlife parks that hold those 150 wildcats that form part of that critical insurance population, and that continues to be really important for future releases, perhaps not just in Scotland, but also in England and Wales in future. So we're really grateful to them. we've used lots of different scientists and different input in order to design this project, and so just a thanks to them, and maybe an idea to some of you for just how much effort it takes to do this. And loads of different people have volunteered, helping building the enclosures and kitting all sorts of stuff out. So yeah, thanks very much. Thanks a lot to you for listening. And if you want to stay in touch with what's going on the Saving Wildcats project, then you can follow us on social media. We put out a newsletter every 2 months where we give all the latest on what's going on the cats. And if you want, you can also adopt one of our cats in the breeding centre and get personalised updates from them. So yeah, feel free to check out everything that's on our website. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much to Helen there. That was fantastic. There's been loads of amazing questions coming in, and we will try our best to get through as many as possible. I think we'll start with the most upvoted question. There's a few. First question is from Roger, and it's, do the cats hunt for their food in the pre-release stage, or are they fed?
That's a really good question. So we aren't allowed to feed live prey in this country, and so the wildcats in the pre-release enclosures are fed. In all of the enclosures are fed different things like rabbits and rats. But the pre-release enclosures are really large naturalistic enclosures, so there's a lot of habitat that the cats can move around in and experience all of that variety of kind of complex, maybe more complex areas to climb in, and different larger climbing structures, and they've got different areas to hide and things like that. But yeah, we aren't able to feed any live prey to the cats in captivity. That is possible with the Iberians project in Spain.
Thank you. And the next question is from Roland, and he started by saying that since the decline of the wildcat in the wild, pine martens have become re-established through most of the highlands. And he's asking, have you assessed the likely impact of each species on the other, especially in released areas?
I think that's a really good question, and the answer is no, because we haven't got any wildcats in the wild, but we are releasing cats into an area where the mesocarnivores, including pine martens, have been really well studied through the Cairngorms Connect Predator project. So actually, I'm hoping we're going to be able to get some answers to that question in due course, because we're certainly going to have the data to answer it.
And there are a few questions similar to this one, so we'll try and not ask it more than once, but there's a few questions regarding purity, in quotation marks. So how reliable are genetic tests for distinguishing hybrids from pure wildcats? Was the pure genetic signature based on museum skins?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we've used quite a lot of different genetic methods to understand hybridization. Most recently, we've used over 100 different whole genomes, which is probably considered to be the most detailed look at genetics that you can do. But we've also in the past used other methods, and we've also applied those methods to a range of different historical samples, including samples collected from museums, from the Natural History Museum and the National Museum of Scotland. So we're pretty confident that our genetic methods are very accurate. Saying that, it's really important to distinguish the accuracy of the methods between to kind of from the level of hybridization. So most wildcats in captivity show some element of hybridization in them, and the majority of wildcats in the wild show some feral hybrid cats in the wild show a hybridization. And we in captivity, what we do is we manage to try and minimize that level of hybridization, and we breed from the cats with the kind of higher hybrid scores. higher levels of wildcat DNA. And we also use genetic methods to manage the population and make choices about which animals to mate with which in terms of relatedness.
And we've got another question from Peter, and it's asking, why did hybridization increase from the 1960s?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question as well. The answer is we don't really know. It's really clear from some technical kind of genomic modeling that we've done, and also looking at the historical samples, that there has been this increase. There's a few different theories as to why that might be. I think probably the most convincing theory is that the populations became really small due to increased efficiency of persecution methods, so technology to conduct predator control, lamping and night vision technology and things like that, and that led to very small populations, and then that really encouraged hybridization. So it's a symptom, but not a primary cause of decline.
I'm just going to ask, there's a fair few questions about the collars themselves. So just to kind of clear away the collar questions. So there's questions like, is there not a danger the collars will get caught and cause problems? And there's people asking, do we remove the collars at a certain stage? Do they fall off? Is there any risk of them causing any issues? That sort of thing. I wonder if you could just talk about the collars a bit more for me.
Yeah, so our field and veterinary team put a huge amount of effort into researching the most appropriate method for collaring the cats. And as I said, we're using a method that's been used widely in other similar studies in Europe, and has also been used previously on cats in Scotland. The collars themselves are really light. They're only about 2% of the cat's body weight, and they're fitted really carefully. And yes, we will be removing them when the batteries run out, and we may consider recollaring some of the cats at that point, so that we can continue to monitor them into the future. And that's something that we're just thinking about at the moment.
Thank you. And the next question is, how are the 9 remaining cats from the last wildcat released in the Cairngorms getting on in the environment?
How are the
9 remaining cats?
No, do you mean 19?
Oh yeah, it could be the 9.
Sorry, yeah. So the cats that have been released. So as I mentioned at the end of the talk, so one cat sadly has died, and the other 18 are out and about. Most of them have stayed local to the release site, and a couple of them have wandered slightly further away. And obviously we're not revealing anything about the locations of the cats, because it's really important that they are allowed to do their thing and remain undisturbed. So probably can't say too much more about that, other than what we've seen. We can follow a lot of everything really that they're doing through the collaring data, and they're behaving kind of as we would expect, using the sorts of habitat that our habitat modelling would have predicted they would have liked.
Kaylee has asked, has there been any research conducted on the effects of wildcat population expansion on vulnerable ground nesting bird populations such as capercaillie?
So we had to do a lot of research into the potential impacts of wildcats on capercaillie in order to receive our translocation licence from Nature Scot. And there's no records of wildcats predating capercaillie. All of that was kind of evidence that was put into the translocation license application. And obviously, because capercaillie and wildcats do live in similar areas within the same landscape, it's something that we'll be monitoring really closely as a population, as the project proceeds.
Thank you. So the next question is, if the kittens are separated from their parents at 5 months, how do they learn the hunting techniques to allow them to survive in the wild?
So they spend the first part of their life with their parents, they are fed a variety of different natural kind of prey items during that time, and that's a really important part of their socialization. But as I've said, we don't feed them live prey in captivity at all. And so but what we do is we present the prey items in a variety of different ways that encourage the kind of training and movements that you would kind of need to act, I guess, optimally as a wildcat in the wild. And we're able to follow that using our CCTV cameras.
There's a question from Roland. How many wildcats do you need to release to establish a viable population? Interesting question, Roland.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And a lot of that depends on how many then survive once you release the wildcats, and also what the rate of reproduction is. So we've done some models to look at that using kind of expected parameters that you might have for a similar release project or for a similar wild living wildcat populations. And that's one of the reasons why the project is kind of targeting to release about 60 cats over 3 years, because that is a number that is kind of being predicted to provide potentially the foundations for a wild population in the future. But there's a lot of kind of ifs in that, and to some extent we've got to see what happens next.
So we've got another genetics question from Daphne, and she's wondering, has breeding programs used some wildcats from Europe to broaden the genetic variation?
We haven't done that yet, but it is part of the project plan in future, and so it's something we're hoping to do within the next couple of years.
Who is the wildcat's natural predator?
I think that's a really good question. Obviously, if we think about the ecosystems that we would have had a range of larger predators within the ecosystem, so including wolves, bears, lynx, and a number of other different species. I don't think there's a lot of records of wildcats being predated by large carnivores, and they certainly, one of the things our keeper team tell us is that the cats have a lot of fight in them, and some of our wildcat keepers have experience of looking after much larger felids. So I suspect they are good at defending themselves against other larger predators. But certainly within the UK now, we would expect the predation on wildcats to be pretty low. I think, there's a possibility that they could come into conflict with some larger birds of prey, but I think it's quite unlikely.
So Ian's wondering, do we know what the cause of the one mortality was?
Yes, so the cat had all of any wildcat that dies, we would always do a post-mortem of, and so the body was retrieved and looked at by our veterinary team, and the cat died of a health condition called peritonitis, which is an infection in the abdomen, and we don't know what the cause of that was, but that's certainly unfortunately why the cat died.
How do you catch the cats to download the data from the collar?
We don't catch them, we just get close to them, and then the field team just get close to them, and then at that point the data download, as long as they're within range of the wildcat, the data download happens automatically. So they're not caught in order to download the data. But good question.
So the next question is asking about sort of voluntary opportunities. So do you have any recommendations for how university students in biological and ecological sciences could volunteer or get involved?
Yeah, so I think the best thing to do is to have a look at our website and sign up to the newsletter. So we advertise our voluntary opportunities through the Saving Wildcats newsletter and website, and we do have a number of different volunteers and paid interns that are working with the project. So it's definitely worth keeping an eye on that if you're interested.
Actually, last year got to help build a pre-release enclosure. It was very good fun. I would recommend doing that if you get the opportunity to do that. There's a question here about how much of a threat would other predators such as foxes and badgers be to newly released wildcats?
I don't think we have any concerns about any other predators in Britain being a threat to the wildcats, because obviously they would be part of the natural ecosystem, and we would expect all of these species to cohabit with each other. And it's really great to be able, as I mentioned earlier, it's really great to be able to do this release into an area where we know quite a lot about the other carnivores, because then we can study their interactions in the future.
And are wildcats shy about mating while captive?
They're not really shy, in the sense that we have a long history of breeding wildcats at the Highland Wildlife Park, and certainly the population doesn't really have any issues with breeding success. It's quite healthy in that sense. There's a lot of breeding success in actually a lot of the captive collection. So that's not one of the kind of limiting factors in terms of how the wildcat population is being managed. Probably what's more limiting is the amount of space that there is in captivity to keep the animals.
And there's a question here from the question is jumping around for me. Hang on. Daphne, is any food provided after release?
Yeah, really good question, and the answer is yes. So we continue to offer food to the wildcats after they're released at the release points, and some of the cats have come back to take food and some of them haven't. And we continue to provision the food until a point where we don't think they need it anymore.
And will you be catching any kittens born in the wild to check whether they're still pure wildcats?
Yeah, so it's going to be really everything. So it's really important that we continue to monitor this population as it hopefully expands, and so monitoring what happens with the kittens is going to be a really important part of that going forwards. Hopefully we'll see some next year if we're lucky.
Margaret has asked, do wildcats meow, with a smiley face?
Well, we get lots of really great calling sounds from the wildcats, particularly during the mating season. So yeah, that's one of the indicators of knowing when it's time to mate.
And what are the main threats today? Is it solely habitat loss and hybridation?
So I think the main threats now currently are hybridization and disease transfer from domestic cats. So domestic cats carry lots of diseases, and it's one of the reasons why it's really important to have a good vaccination program with domestic cats as well. And the other threat is persecution, because some predator control activities are not particularly discriminate. It's not very easy to see exactly what animal is maybe being targeted, for example, in using night vision imagery or thermal imagery, and so persecution still continues to be a potential threat, especially if it's kind of an indiscriminate method. And one of the other ones is road traffic mortality as well, which of course affects lots of different wildlife species.
We've got another question from Joanne here. How do you teach the kittens to hunt? Do you release wild prey for them? Or you answered that second bit earlier on, but how do you teach kittens to hunt?
Well, they are looked after by their parents, and so that's the primary method. But as I mentioned, we don't feed live prey, and so really they are when they go out into the wild, that's the first time they're in the wild, and so they've got to obviously become efficient hunters. But we do see lots of evidence in captivity of the sorts of things, ingredients that go into hunting, like, for example, waiting and stalking and things like that.
And Ellie's wondering, if you were to start from the beginning again, would you do anything differently?
That's a really good question. And I think it's a really important question, because it's really important to review everything that you do in conservation projects and kind of adapt and change as you go forwards. And we're certainly doing that at the moment. I think there's maybe not too much we would change. I think we're learning a lot about what kind of how much time different things are taking, because obviously everything to do with wild animals is potentially quite unpredictable. And so one of the really important things is that we were able to kind of make sure we've got enough time for the field team to go around and things like that. So there's quite a lot of considerations in terms of resourcing a project like this. And so that's probably one of the things that I think all conservation projects learn, is that things sometimes can take longer than expected.
That's a very interesting question. I like that one a lot. We've got a question from Sally here. Do the cats interact with each other, or are they solitary?
Cats spend a lot of time on their own in the wild, but we definitely can see from the GPS collaring data that they are crossing paths and interacting with each other occasionally. And also we do house some of the cats jointly in captivity we have housed some of the cats jointly in captivity in the pre-release enclosures, so they've spent some time interacting there as well.
Could you say a bit more about the response to the project from local gamekeepers?
We've, as I mentioned in an earlier part of the presentation, we consulted with about 60 different landowners prior to the release of cats, and we now that the cats are released, we're in contact with a lot of different landowners, and people who are landowners are able to opt to be part of a kind of messaging group to stay in touch with updates if they have wildcats on their land. And I think that's been, from what we can tell, that's been quite positively received, and we're certainly something that we're really committed to as a project. Is making sure that we have that really open dialogue with people, so that if people have encounter potential issues with having wildcats on their land, that they are able to come and talk to us really quickly.
I'm losing track now. I think it's me to ask now. There's a question: do you keep the pairing the same, or do you mix the pairs?
I think that's probably to do with the parental pairs for captive breeding, and we do a bit of both. So every year we plan, David Barkley, who's the stub keeper for Wildcats, plans the breeding pairs for the next cohort of wildcats to go out into the wild, and we've kept some of the parents the same, and we change some of the parents around, kind of depending on what our using some analysis in the stub book tells us to do, and a number of other practical considerations as well.
And will getting through the winter be as likely to be difficult regarding prey for the releases?
Yeah, I think for sure. Anyone who's familiar with the area around the release site will know that the winters can be really, really harsh, and it can be quite variable. Last year the winter was slightly milder than the previous year, when we had a lot of snow on the ground for a long time. So it just depends. There may be a bit of luck involved in that, but certainly we are anticipating that as we go into winter, the prey levels will decline, and that's going to put extra pressure on the cats for sure. So that's one of the really important things, is going to be to monitor what happens over the winter season.
There's a question.
Sorry, there's other things like, recently we had the flooding events in the Strath, and we've got, I think everyone's probably aware, we've got some pretty bad weather coming in right now, so we really there's a lot of unpredictability probably in terms of how that could impact on the population.
There's a question from Charlotte. Have any of the cats returned to the holding pens after being released?
The cats, some of the cats, so the cats, the holding pens or the soft release pens are distributed across various parts of the release site, and we've seen quite variable behaviour from the cats. So there's been some cats that have not come back at all to the pens, and as I mentioned, they've not come back to take any supplementary food at the pens. And there have been some cats that have come back and quite repeatedly over a period of time, and that's something that we monitor very closely. And as I said, as they begin to become less reliant on the food, the cats that have been coming back maybe more often, and then we reduce the food that we're feeding them. But we've had quite a variable response to that, and there's not really been much of a pattern in terms of that behaviour. Perhaps the only thing that we could say is that, as would be kind of expected by feline biology, that the male cats tend to range a bit more widely and potentially are a bit bolder in terms of crossing areas that are maybe a bit more risky, like roads and things like that, than the female cats.
And Jenny wants to know, what should we do if we think we've seen a wildcat? Is there anyone we can report to? Yeah, so it'd be really good to submit your sightings to Mammal Web, and I think you can find on the Saving Wildcats website, you can find under the frequently asked questions, I think you can find a page that will tell you how to do that. And those sightings then get passed to our team who do some verification on them.
We have a question from Gordon. Are there any plans for any follow-on projects when the current one ends?
Not yet, but I think as I kind of mentioned, recovering a species like the wildcat, certainly across larger areas of Scotland, is likely to be a long-term effort. And so we're very much hoping that we're going to be able to contribute to a kind of sustained recovery effort for this species in the future. But at the moment, the project that's funded by the European Union LIFE project grant is projected to end in 2026.
And Rachel wants to know, do you count the hybrid cats as feral cats and so neuter them, or do you leave them to breed with the wildcats?
Sorry, can you read that question out again? So
do you count the hybrid cats as feral cats and so neuter them, or do you leave them to breed with the wildcats?
So feral hybrid wildcats are neutered, and they're identified using the pelage co-colouring system, and so they undergo trap, neuter, vaccinate, release, and then we'll return to where they came from.
Miriam has asked, were they released in pairs?
So we released the cats in small groups. But individually, they were housed individually in their pre-release enclosures. But it varied a little bit. Sometimes we released cats, a few different cats at the same time, and sometimes they were released individually.
And we've got some questions just about the general biology of the cats as well. So someone wants to know, how long they live, and someone else has asked whether they are diurnal and where they rest.
So we don't really know how long wildcats live in the wild. Probably, I'm imagining about 8 years old is going to be the oldest, and certainly you're thinking, in captivity. I think, and I'm not actually 100% certain on this, but I think the oldest record might be about 15 years old. But I would need to double check that. And of course, in the wild, it's very difficult to get that sort of data. And the cats are very, what we call crepuscular. So they tend to be active during dawn and dusk. And that is very much in general the pattern that we see both in captivity and in the wild. Although interestingly, there is some individual variation in that, and that's one of the really interesting things that we've been seeing by being able to follow the cats really closely, is that they're certainly not all the same. They do different things, and they have different kind of habits in terms of how they behave during the course of the day.
Just to say milestone, we are at single-digit questions, so very well done, Helen. I realise it's a lot of questions. Thank you very much for your time.
Wow, it's a lot, so it's great.
Just to say as well, if you're able to just speak quite close to the microphone. Sometimes when you go further back, there's just been a few comments
sorry.
about the sound.
Yeah.
No worries at all. No worries at all. There's just been a few people that have mentioned. Just say as well, if people put on their show captions, really quite accurate as well, if people are struggling with any sound at all. There's a question from Stuart. Could Helen explain a bit more about funding? Is it easier to get support at the start? Do they have financial support for the long term? How long?
Oh, Stuart, thanks. That's a great question. Well, we have done a lot of fundraising for this project, and the project is supported by a big grant from the European Union, but also by a lot of different organisations, and I put up some of the logos of those organisations in my talk. We've got we're actively fundraising for the project and to support future phase 2. And so that's really important, and there's a whole variety of ways that people can support us if they would like to. It's obviously an opportunity to get a plug in there, and obviously thanks to Jessie, who has been really great at supporting fundraising for this project.
Try my best. Just to say as well, so there's a few options, so you can give monthly just to the project without kind of receiving anything other than potentially newsletter, and then we have sponsor a Wildcat where you can give at different levels. You get very fun things. It also makes a great Christmas present, just saying. And then, just as Helen was saying, we do fundraise in a variety of ways, and the main way that I fundraise is using the trust and foundation route. So we write very beautiful proposals and reports with the help of the Saving Wildcats team, and try and get the money in basically to keep the project going. But as Helen said, there's lots of ways that individuals can support as well.
Thanks, Jessie. Yeah, it's a really important part of planning a project like this.
So the next question is, will all the kittens be released, or is there any reason some kittens would not be released? For example, if they're too weak?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we didn't release all of the cats that we were planning to release this year. There was one cat that unfortunately it's not been possible to release for health reasons, and there are 2 other cats that at the point we were due to release them, we felt hadn't reached a sufficient body weight in order to release them, and that's, as I mentioned, the cats need to be a certain size in order to wear the collars, and so they weren't released because it was thought that they were too small to wear the collars, and so those cats will hopefully be released next year when we do the releases next summer.
Sorry, there's a few typing to answers going on. Bear with me. Eddie has asked, what will be the effect of the released cats breeding with the already hybridized cats?
So we're hoping that isn't going to be a big phenomenon, because we've done a lot of trap, neuter, vaccinate, release in and around the release site. And as I mentioned earlier in the talk, there are a very small number of cats in the actual release site, and those have been identified and they're neutered. But it's definitely going to be an ongoing challenge and possibility, especially if the population expands.
So the next question is about the badger distribution details. Can this be passed to Scottish badgers?
Hi, thanks for that question, which is probably coming from Scottish badgers, I'm sure. I can, if you get in touch with us, I'm sure we can talk with you about that. At the moment, that data is going to feed into the monitoring efforts that's happening as part of the Cairngorms Connect Predator project. But if you get in touch with us, I can put our field team in touch with you to discuss maybe having access to that data.
We are down to 4 questions. I can't believe it. Someone has asked, predators may include large raptors / eagles, surely. I've heard them take domestic cats. Is that a concern?
Yeah, so I did mention that, and maybe I wasn't close enough to the microphone, but I think there is a small possibility that eagles could take an animal that's the size of a wildcat, and I do know that there's obviously instances of domestic cats being predated by eagles. I don't think it's something that we're spending any time worrying about, and I think it's highly unlikely. And obviously, if it did happen, it would be a natural predation event. Yeah, so I mean, watch this space. Maybe we'll find out. But I don't think it's one that we think is likely to contribute in any major way to the wildcat population, to wildcat population mortality.
And Eddie's wanting to know how many males and females were released.
How many males and females were released? The release cohort consisted of approximately 50% males and 50% females. And if I'm perfectly honest with you, you are testing me here, and off the top of my head, I can't remember the sex ratio, but I'm sure if you want to send us an email, we can tell you that.
There's a question here. Is there any difference between the DNA from the 1800s to the present day for pure, in quotation mark, wildcats?
That's a really good question. I think we don't know too much about that yet. I think we might get the answer for that in future, because doing genetic analysis on old samples is quite challenging, and we don't get very high resolution genetic data out of them. I think it's quite possible that we might have higher levels of genetic diversity in older wildcat populations, because genetic diversity tends to be lost as populations become smaller. But we don't know that for sure. But I think it's something we may get at in the next couple of years.
And our final question is from Karen, and she's wanting to know, is it more difficult for 1.5-year-old cats, if they're not released in the first year, for them to adjust to a life in the wild?
We don't know. We don't have a particular reason for suspecting that. And I think that over time, as we release more wildcats, we might get answers for some of these questions. But all projects like this are quite challenging, because even though we've released 19 cats, and hopefully we're going to be releasing quite a lot more wildcats in the future, people will kind of appreciate that the sample sizes there are quite small, and so to be able to say anything with any certainty about, say, what influences what specific aspects of an individual's life history influence its survival in the wild, or how it does in the wild, could be really quite challenging. So we're expecting to not be able to get at those answers for some time to come.
Wow,
Amazing.
well, I'm
Yeah.
really glad that we were able to get through everyone's questions as well. So thanks everyone for coming along and listening to Helen there. That was all really interesting. And thank you, Helen, for coming in and sharing that journey with us. We all really appreciate that. Just a note to say as well, if you'd like to keep updated on all of the work that we're doing with the Scottish Wildlife Trust Young Leaders, best way to do that would be to give us a follow on X, formerly Twitter. Our handle is at ScottWild_YL. So at ScottWild_YL. And we will update that every so often on projects, events. And right now it's all a lot of pictures of dogs and cats and maybe even the odd hedgehog, because we're focusing on mammals. So it's a good thing to be following if you're not already. And just over to you again, Helen, for any final words.
Great, thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for all the amazing questions. I'm feeling quite exhausted now after having to answer all that number, but it's really great to have those questions. And yeah, just great to speak to you. Thanks very much to Scottish Wildlife Trust for inviting us to be part of this, and the young leaders. And yeah, and stay tuned for more updates.
Amazing.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much, Helen, for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone.